Welcome to this question and answer episode on the Divine Will by Elijah's Cloak. We put together some questions. They come from a variety of sources. And if you do not see your question in this list, it could be because we edited the questions. Some questions were rather long and some were repeated. And you may not see your question here, but you may see the related subject matter of your question. So let's start with the first question. And it is, how is the divine mercy related to the divine will? And it's a very good question. I've seen this elaborated upon for a long period of time. And actually I saw a couple episodes devoted to the subject. For the purposes of this episode, what we'll do is we'll try to answer that concisely. The Divine Mercy is a book written by St. Faustina Kowalska, and I've read the Divine Mercy. It's actually a very important book, and I consider it one of the most important books that were ever written. And what I would say about it is, first let's look at the differences when we talk about the Divine Mercy as opposed to the Divine Will. The first difference is that the Divine Mercy is a devotion, and the Divine Will is a gift that's being described by Jesus as a fiat that's on the same level as the creation, redemption, and then the sanctification of the divine will. The other difference is, and this may be argued by some theologians, but the divine mercy is an attribute of God. And those who have read the Book of Heaven and the other writings by Luisa Piccarreta understand that divine will is more of the essence of God. So when we talk about the will, we're talking about a faculty of the soul. The will, the memory, the intellect. So when we talk about the divine will of God, we're in fact talking about the essence of God. And it is because of sharing the divine will with the essence of God that we participate in God's divinity, as Jesus describes in the Book of Heaven. And when you speak about the relationship of one thing to another, in this case the divine mercy to the divine will, it's important to understand that the divine will does not in any way replace the divine mercy. The divine mercy devotion is integrated within the divine will. In other words, the divine will is not intended to supplant anything that has occurred before it. And we talk a little bit about that in the common mistakes, or the 6 common mistakes or misunderstandings concerning what people understand about the divine will. The divine mercy devotion is integrated within the divine will, and the divine will builds upon everything that has come before it. The second question is a very interesting one. Will the divine will lead to the triumph of the Immaculate Heart? And we created a video early on in Elijah Cloak's channel and about the triumph of the Immaculate Heart, but unfortunately had some audio difficulties, so we took it down, and we incorporated some of the content into another video that is called Prophecy of Luisa Piccarreta. And to answer the question, the divine will, I believe that the answer in short is yes, and I'll explain why. And also there's another question that's coming right after this one that's related to it, But the divine will is going to be, as Jesus mentions in the Book of Heaven, as a sun rising from the church. And in rising from the church, it will illuminate the whole world. And it is through the divine will and the spread of the divine will, and we talked about this in other videos, the conversion of nations, that we will actually establish the triumph of the Immaculate Heart. And instead of elaborating on that here, what I'm going to do is go to the next question, because the two are tied together. And the next question is, what are the 9 choirs of the divine will? So there's a lot of interest right now in Fatima, and I think that's probably also part of the reason for the question regarding the triumph of the Immaculate Heart. In a famous quote from Fatima, "In the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph." The reason why it's related to the 9 choirs of the divine will is that the choirs will be first created on earth and then in heaven, which is amazing. So it actually speaks to the fulfillment of the Our Father, may your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And I'm going to need to read a few excerpts from the Book of Heaven to explain the 9 choirs of the divine will more. Let me start with the first one. It's from volume 23, February 28th, 1928. It will have its 9 choirs, and they will distinguish themselves from one another according to the varieties of beauties that they have acquired by knowing, some more, some less, the knowledges that pertain to my fiat. In other words, the knowledges that are in the Book of Heaven. Another excerpt is from volume 35, August 9th, 1937. We will give her the great glory, her being the Blessed Virgin Mary, the great glory of having her form the new hierarchy that will be similar to the 9 choirs of angels. So she will have the choir of seraphim, cherubim, and so forth, as well as the new order of the saints who lived in her inheritance. After she has formed them on earth, she will take them to heaven, surrounding herself with a new hierarchy, the newborn in the divine fiat, reborn in her own love, those who lived in her inheritance. And it's a little disappointing to me. I never hear anyone talking about these paragraphs here in the Book of Heaven regarding the 9 choirs of the divine will. It seems to be very much overlooked, but so important. There's one other paragraph that I like to read, going back to the same volume I started with, volume 23, February 28th, 1928. If you knew what difference will pass between those who bring my knowledges from the earth and those who acquire them in heaven. There's a lot to be discussed here, but I need to make this a little short, so I'll be brief. The first will have them as their own endowments, and one will see them in them the nature of the divine beauty, and will hear the same sounds of joys and happinesses that their Creator makes, one here and forms. On the other hand, in the second, which are those who receive them in heaven, these will be neither their own nature nor their own endowments, but they will receive them as the effect of the communication of others. So in other words, those who receive them on earth, the gifts of the divine will, and form the hierarchy of the 9 choirs of the divine will, they will receive the divine life from Jesus of his divine will, and receive the fullness of the gift on earth. And those in heaven will receive that gift from those who come to heaven within these choirs. In other words, those who have received the divine will during their lives and have gone to heaven. And a couple things here is, this is because the gift of the divine will was never given before. It did not exist in the lives of the saints. It's a gift for our times. And what you hear described here in these paragraphs regarding the 9 choirs of the divine will is the triumph of the Immaculate Heart, the establishment of the 9 choirs of the divine will by our Blessed Mother on earth, and taking this choir and forming it into heaven as well. The next question, please explain. This is another very interesting question. Please explain the difference between bilocation in the divine will and the bilocation of the saints, such as Padre Pio. So the bilocation of the saints, literal translation, means to be in 2 places at once. And the bilocation that has been documented by saints, and not just Padre Pio, but other saints as well, is a physical bilocation. They're actually in 2 locations at the same time. And a great example is Padre Pio. Padre Pio never left San Giovanni Rotondo. However, he was seen, physically seen, in other locations. And it's true of other saints as well. And it's not just seen by one person, where you have one person's account, you may be mistaken, but by many people. And one account, he was seen by the Pope in the Vatican, while he never left his residency. However, in the divine will, you're not bilocating, you're not physically in 2 different places. But because you're sharing the divinity of Jesus, his divine will, divinity of his divine will, you are actually sharing in his omnipresence. And that is true because his divine will, as he describes in the Book of Heaven, is everywhere. And to emphasize it, he said it was even present in hell. So it is literally everywhere through all creation, past, present, and future. It's in every act, it's in every molecule, it's everywhere. And when you share in a divine act, you are sharing how the divine will exist in all locations at once and through all time. And that's really the omnipresence, and that's a more accurate term. Next question. After 80 years since Luisa wrote the Book of Heaven, why has the divine will not spread more than it has? The simple answer is that the divine will has not spread as much as you would expect, because it's God's will that it has not spread at this moment, and is just starting to really spread. Well, I mentioned Padre Pio earlier, so I'm going to go back to him because he's a great source. So St. Padre Pio foresaw this, actually. He mentioned to Father Bucci's aunt, Rosaria, that Luisa's light would be known in the next millennium. And the next millennium is this millennium. So it wasn't for the end of the last century. It's really for this century. So the answer is that it is not spread until now because it's God's will. Now you can ask the question, why is God willing that? Why doesn't God will it to spread sooner? And I would say this for the same reason that in volume 26, Jesus said that a soul cannot bear to stand before him while stained with sin. So he first purges the soul of its sin. And the same is true for our world, for the church. And we're going through a period of purgation that's similar to the prayer that Luisa would have as she goes to communion. Purify me, illuminate me, sanctify me. So before we're sanctified, we need to be purified, and we need that period of purification. Another question is about the degrees of the divine will, and the shortened question is, how do we know what degree of the divine will that we are in? Which is a good question. It's one of the reasons why we made the videos on the degrees of the divine will. And I would say that the first and the fourth degree are easy to understand that you're there. Very easy to understand. It's more of when am I in the second and the third. Those are a little bit more difficult, but the first and the fourth are easy. So understand the first. The first encompasses everything, right? Like as we said, the divine will is everywhere. So the first degree of the divine will, everyone exists in, that do not exist in the next degrees. And maybe you could think of it like the first degree encompasses all four. So first degree is everywhere. So that's easy. So the real question becomes, how do I know when I'm close to leaving the first degree and going into the second? And you'll know that because besides asking for the gift of the divine will, besides reading the writings of the Book of Heaven and other writings by Luisa, you'll have established within your life a well-ordered life, a life where you attempt not to live in a manner that's injurious to God and one that avoids sin. And you'll have an established prayer regimen. So once you have that and you see that in yourself, you're coming to the next degree, the second degree. In the second degree, you'll know you're there because it's really the onset of contemplation. And you might say, well, I've never been a contemplative, but if you prayed around, you're a contemplative. That's a prayer of contemplation. You're contemplating going throughout all eternity in different acts of people and providing reparation for them. Or in the case of creation, an act of God, you're going into them, those acts, through the participation in Jesus' divine will, and you are actually giving them back to Jesus with an I love you. And so you're forming those acts within yourself, as we discussed earlier about how the omnipresence allows you to exist in all acts. In the third, I would refer to the third degree is you're living a blessed life. It's a life where you see the divine will readily in your life and in the world. Even the people who are opposed to, say, the good or the church, you understand their role in the divine will. So you start saying things like, as Father John Brown used to say, it's all good. Everything's good. Yeah. Or don't worry. Yeah, you don't worry because you understand it's the divine will and you understand where it's going. In the fourth degree, there is probably, and I mentioned it's easy to understand that you're in the fourth degree, is one I mentioned before in discussing the fourth degree is that I've heard people in cenicals describe, and it's very, very frequently that if they are in the fourth degree, that there's a test. So there's a test, and it's very interesting that this test is needed. And you could think of other tests. Look at the test Adam had, and look at the test the angels had. So in the book of heaven, Jesus actually tells Luisa something very interesting. He says that without the test, you would be like a slave. And there is no slavery in the divine will. So I found that very surprising. And I was always wondering why there were these tests. And the reason being is, you think about it, if Jesus, basically plows the road ahead of you, makes everything easy, and gives everything to you, and there's no test. There's never a test on your part, a test of the will, test of the human will. Then you really are a slave. You would become like a slave. You would be addicted to the sweetness and honey that you're receiving in life from the gifts that you're receiving from Jesus. In other words, you would live a life where everything is perfect, everything is given to you, and of course you would love God. You would love God. But something goes wrong. Something goes wrong in your life. Do you still love God? That's the test. That's a test. And these tests, they come in different forms. They usually seem like they involve something where there's an attachment. It may not be a bad attachment, but it's an attachment that nevertheless keeps the soul back from proceeding to God. And Jesus is looking for that test to be overcome. It may not even be that important in itself, but what is important is the test. And if the test is passed, and I think that Jesus wants everyone to pass that test, so it kind of gives you the answers in the book of heaven. But if you pass that test, there's usually another thing that's kind of unique in the divine will, is there's a supernatural event, some sort of supernatural occurrence, and they seem to be different, but they seem to be, I was going to say common, but I shouldn't say common. They seem to be associated with moving into the fourth degree. And of course, if you live in the fourth degree, there's no sin. You do not sin. And yes, there are people walking among us that have been born in sin through the stain of original sin, but currently walk without sin. They do not sin, in other words, even though they were born in sin. This is 7, I believe. Number 7, is it okay for a cenacle not to have a priest? Now, I never spoke much about cenacles or the priesthood, so I want to take an opportunity to do that a little bit here. The short answer is yes, it is. It's okay to have a cenacle without a priest, and many cenacles, that's the way they start, without priests. Now, that being said, I've seen cenacles with and without priests, and cenacles with priests are definitely better. And the reason being is priests are trained to do this. The priests, and more importantly, they're consecrated. And I'll take an excerpt out of the Book of Heaven to expound upon the importance of the priesthood. It is a great necessity to form the first priest. They will serve me like the apostles served me to form my church. And that was volume 23, January 18, 1928. So that's an important statement. The priests will serve me like the apostles served me to form my church. So the priests that are the first priests in the divine will are like apostles. And I do look at the priests that are currently promoting the divine will to be just that. Now, there is a role for the laity. So let's talk about the laity a little bit as well. So the role of the laity is to, if you think of the priests as their role is to preach and teach the good news of the kingdom of the divine will, and to serve as the trumpets of Jesus for the divine will, the role of the laity is to transmit this good news to others. And the Catechism, the Catholic Church explains, the laity have responsibility in evangelization. Another source is the City of God. City of God, St. Augustine describes the relationship between the laity and the religious as two sides of the same body. So we're all working together in the divine will. So I want to be clear, there is a role for the laity, and obviously the priesthood is very much needed. And I also want to be clear that when you emphasize the vital role and necessity of the priesthood, that does not in any way diminish the role of the laity. As a matter of fact, an example in a cenacle that I was listening to someone speak, and the way that they came into the divine will and learned about it is through someone's example. In other words, someone who was already in the divine will, living it, they served as a witness. And this person said, like, I can see and hear it just like it was yesterday. I wanted to know what changed that man. And that's how he became interested in the divine will, and he's in fact someone who's advanced in the divine will. I myself am another example. I first heard about the divine will from a lay apostolate. So that's how the faith in times of the apostles was transmitted, from the words of the apostles, the teachings of the apostles, the preaching, to the laity, what would become the laity of the church, and the laity transmitted it to others. That's how it works. It's like a pebble dropped in a placid lake that forms ever-expanding ripples. And if you have multiple apostles and you spread them around, you have pebbles dropping in different parts of the lake, and their ripples interact, and the ripples get bigger because they coincide with each other. So going back to the question about the cenacles, we need more cenacles. And Jesus tells Luisa that he would like to have a soul living in the divine will in every town. And a way to make that happen is to have a cenacle in every parish. So I'm running out of time here. I think I'm going a little bit long here, but I want to talk a little bit more about the cenacle. So I want to encourage people to form cenacles. And some may say, well, I look for a cenacle and I can't find one. Well, maybe that's because you didn't start one yet. So try this. Go to your pastor, ask to have a cenacle, a prayer group, meet on parish property. And then, when you speak to him, be prepared to speak about the status of Luisa's cause and something about the divine will, so that he may not know anything about Luisa. And if he agrees, ask for a small blurb to be put in the weekly parish bulletin, providing the when and the where. If he doesn't agree, try having it at your home. Ask to have it at your home, and maybe you're not comfortable with that. Maybe you want to have it a third location, but think about that. Think about having it in somewhere else, and still ask for a blurb in the bulletin. I mean, you're a parishioner. Ideally, if you have someone else, there's two of you, and the way you start off with cenacles, you may be by yourself, and you need to do an outreach to others. This is the way to do it. Now, if you get agreement and you start the cenacle, be prepared to sit there for 3 or 4 weeks by yourself. Be persistent. Do something that's worthwhile with that time. Read more. Read the Book of Heaven. And as your cenacle acquires members, and this is another important part of it, go to a holy priest in your parish and ask if he can provide spiritual direction to your cenacle. So most priests will have difficulty in good conscience turning away people who are asking for spiritual direction. Now, there's a lot of time constraints that priests are faced with. But even if you cannot get a priest to join, just asking. So if you ask a pastor, can I have a cenacle in the parish? You ask a priest, can you provide spiritual direction for my cenacle? We're talking about Luisa Piccarreta and Divine Will. What they may do, even if you're not successful in getting what you want, what they may do is they may say, who is this Luisa Piccarreta that people are asking about? Let me look into that a little bit. You may be planting a seed. You may create another apostle of the divine will that we just talked about. Very important. Don't be afraid of failure. Even if you did this and you did not get the ability to meet on the property of the parish, did not get a spiritual director for the cenacle, Jesus is very pleased with your action. But thanks for asking that. Will other religious orders, is the next question, start their own orders of the divine will, or just the Benedictines? So the thought is here that the Benedictines have started the Sisters of the Divine Will and the Monks of the Divine Will, and they're both located in Italy. And the question is, will it only be the Benedictines, or will the other orders start their own orders of the Divine Will? So, I'm very happy to see the Benedictines start those orders. Very happy. And there's been a long-standing disagreement, friendly rivalry, so to speak, about which order was started first. And the Order of Carmel, they date their order back to the time of Elijah on Mount Carmel. And the Benedictines have an order that started roughly about 1,300 years ago or so. And they have a written rule of St. Benedict and St. Scholastica. I have to confess that they were the first ones to have a written monastic rule. And I definitely say that they're the first ones to start an order of the divine will. And I think that's appropriate. Now, the divine will is not a charism for religious. In other words, it's not a religious order charism. In other words, it's not like the Order of Carmel's devotion to prayer or the Franciscans' poverty. It's not that type of charism. It's the divine will is for all the religious orders, just like the redemption is for all orders. So you don't have an order of the redemption, or so it's for every order, and I expect all orders to adopt the divine will. Now, in some cases, you may run into resistance where they believe that, St. Francis is all we need. We have St. Francis, St. Clare, whatever order it is, St. Teresa of Avila, St. Therese, St. John of the Cross, St. Dominic. These are our fathers of the order. And this is what we need, this is our identity, and we don't need this Luisa Piccarreta. So I'm paraphrasing some thoughts. Here are some objections. But as I mentioned, it's not a charism. So it's not particular to a saint. It's not particular to a charism of an order. It's for all orders and all saints. So for those who think that way, I would argue make the same argument that Jesus made to those who claim to be sons of Abraham, and that Abraham was their father. And Jesus would say, well, Abraham did not would not do like you're doing. Abraham would not reject me. Abraham would listen to me. Abraham would love to see the day that you are seeing today. And the same with the saints of these orders. So just think of St. Francis. St. Francis doing the rounds in the divine will. He would love the opportunity to have done that, but the gift was not available at his time. St. John of the Cross contemplating in the divine will. It's amazing just to think of these things. But it was not available for him in his time. Looking at the writings of St. John of the Cross, it appears that he envisioned the gift of the divine will. He wrote so clearly about it, but he did not possess it. And he would long to possess it. These are really good questions and tough questions to answer, and we may do this again. I have some videos on the channel that are pertinent to Fatima and Garabandal, and I think we're going to do another Q&A just on those two, because there's a lot of questions regarding those. There's a lot of interest. This goes back to the question about the triumph of the Immaculate Heart. It goes back to the Fatima statement, in the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph. There's a lot of interest in Fatima these days because there's a couple books that have come out, and there's questions regarding if the consecration to the Immaculate Heart was done. Was it done in 1984, done in 1952? There's disagreement, and some say it was never done. So let's do a Q&A on that, and I think there's going to be a lot of interest. And this is a way of reaching out. So we want to reach out in different areas. So talking about other Marian apparitions like Fatima and Garabandal, and we did one on Our Lady of Knock. There's one I've been recently, or one that recently came to my attention, is the Lady of Revelation in Rome back in 1947, and the continued locutions that were obtained by Bruno Cornacchiola, I believe. I hope I didn't mispronounce that. And he received those to his death, up to his death, I believe, which was in 2001. I found some really interesting information there. There's not a lot that's out there in English, so I'm obtaining a translation, and I'm going to do a little research on that and provide that. And this is a way of reaching out to people who are interested in other areas. If you look at my videos we do in Garabandal or Fatima, we always talk about Luisa Piccarreta in those as well. And they have a lot of interest. And it's a way of introducing Luisa to people who may not have ever heard of Luisa. So God bless everyone, and thanks for listening.